Let's look at Indian swords and swordsmanship. And specifically that old favourite topic of hilt size. Now, for those of you who are new to this topic, I'll try and go through this as quickly as possible for those of you who are not new to this topic. There is lots of debate around the size of Indian hilts. That being because a lot of antique Indian swords, when you pick them up, you really struggle to fit your hand into them. So I don't know whether it's visible on screen, but I'm very much struggling to get my hand into this sword. And a lot of them are too small. Now, this isn't just a modern phenomenon. For those of you who are saying, oh, modern people are bigger than old-fashioned people, that's to some degree a little bit true. But this phenomenon is actually noted in 19th century and older, I think probably late 18th century as well. But definitely 19th century sources refer to the small size of Indian hilts for European hands. There's lots of things to be said about different groups of people, dietary, childhood nutrition, all this kind of stuff. So clearly not everyone in the world, certainly in the 19th century and even not now, not everyone in the world is the same size. In general, Europeans, for example, an English person on average is taller than a person in Nepal, for example. You just look at the Gurkhas and you look at the Royal Marines, there's an average height difference, okay? And this was certainly noted in World War I, if we go back to the beginning of the 20th century. And it was certainly noted in the 19th century as well. So yes, different groups of people have different average height. Within the 19th century and 19th century sources, there was a general perception that in the north of India, certainly in the Punjab and northwest frontier, if we go into Afghanistan, then generally speaking, people were taller and bigger than if we certainly if we go to Nepal. The Nepalese are described as being very small. But if we go down to the south of India, there is a general observation. How accurate it was, I don't know, but there's a general observation that North Indians were taller than South Indians. And indeed, in some cases, the certain Pathans, for example, Pathans were regarded as, on average, slightly bigger than average Europeans at that time. So this isn't a kind of sort of European racist outlook on it, although I'm sure that would play a part as well. Certain groups of people were regarded as bigger than Europeans. Okay, so there was a certain degree of just, yeah, that's the way it is. In that area, people are a bit shorter, and that area, people are a bit bigger. But tulwars, specifically, this iconic type of Indian sword, are found all over India, and therefore they come in a variety of different hilt styles, but they do have basic certain aspects of the hilt which are basically the same. Okay, so we've got a cross guard of sorts and we've got a disc pommel of sorts. Now, in previous videos I've made the point that this disc pommel enforces a certain way of cutting. Now, we know from numerous sources that there is a distinctive way of cutting with the Indian sword, or the tulwar in this case, which is particular and really strongly encouraged in India for a number of reasons. We know that from the modern surviving practice of Indian martial arts, such as Gatka and Shastra Vidya and Kalari Pyatu and things like this. And additionally, we've got historical documentation for that, both Indian and British. So even if we just look at the British sources, which obviously I'm most familiar with, they talk about this. They talk about the Indian way of cutting with a sword as being distinct and different from the European way of cutting with a sword. Again, I've covered this in previous videos, but just to cover it really quickly, if we grab a European sabre, the general rule is that with a European sabre, a lot of the motion will come from the rotation of the wrist. Okay, so the momentum of the sword will come from turning at the wrist, whereas if I pick up a tulwar that fits my hand a little bit better, and we'll talk about that in a minute, whereas it seems to be that in, not just in India incidentally, also in parts of the Middle East, North Africa and other parts of Asia as well, there was an encouragement to cut with the elbow and shoulder, and indeed give a full passing body of motion, and actually to keep the wrist quite stiff. Now obviously if you have a large disc pommel like this, that discourages you from extending the hand out, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, then indeed, if you're keeping a stiff wrist and using the whole body, then you're going to be drawing through with the motion of the elbow and the shoulder and the arm and the twist of the hips and the shoulders and stepping with the feet, which I realise my feet are off camera, but I can assure you I'm passing feet. So it's a bigger, wider, more powerful movement. Now you might think that's quite exposed. And indeed, you could argue that in a single sword system, where we're facing off one person against one person with a sword, indeed that cutting from the wrist is a narrower spaced movement and doesn't expose you as much. But you have to remember that the dal or shield usually accompanied the sword in Indian swordsmanship. Obviously not always, you didn't always have your shield to hand, but I think that the systems of swordsmanship that we find in India are heavily influenced by the almost omnipresence of shields and bucklers. So what really inspired me to make this video, and what I want to point out in this video, is that while it is certainly true that lots of tulwars are incredibly uncomfortable for someone of my sort of size, I'm about 6'1", and my hands are not small, they're not the biggest, but they're certainly, I would say, above average. It is not comfortable at all for me to use this sword. Could I use it at a pinch if my life depended on it? Yes, absolutely. It'd be somewhat painful. And in fact, I will demonstrate to you just how much my hand does not fit in here. You can see the flesh of my hand bulging around that disc pommel is just not big enough for me. And my index finger is jammed into the knuckle bow. So this hilt is not big enough for me in just about every direction. The knuckle bow is too close to my knuckles. The back of the guard here, the quillon, is jamming into the back of my hand, and the edges of this disc guard are cutting into the bottom of my hand here. Even if I keep a stiff wrist, it digs into my hand, something horrible. Certainly when I go to try and change direction, certainly if I stop the sword in midair, ouch. It is really, really uncomfortable. It's sort of torture. So a lot of people make conclusions about Indian sword hilts based purely on the fact that they have handled one or two or even several that are too small for them. Now some people might say, that's not too small for you, Matt, you just need to get used to it. And you know, I've made comments like this in regards to Viking era hilts, for example. But the fact is that I get to handle lots of Indian swords, huge numbers of Indian swords in my life. I don't know, hundreds of tulwars I've handled, and I've probably owned more than 100 tulwars in my life. And the simple fact is that the hilts vary in size. Now I'm going to show you another tulwar here, which doesn't have any of the problems that we've just looked at. Okay, this doesn't have a knuckle bow on it, but you can see that the cross guard isn't cutting into my hand at front or back. The disc isn't cutting into my base of my hand, the heel of my hand down here. It's completely comfortable to use. Now, although this tulwar is still supposed to be used from the elbow and shoulder with these drawing motions, the fact is that this hilt is big enough that I can just about use it from the wrist. It's not incredibly comfortable, I have to say. It's still making me want to cut from the elbow. It's not like the saber hilt, which is absolutely fine to extend out in line with the forearm. I can't really do that with this sword because the disc pommel still gets in the way, even though the hilt's bigger. But the fact is that I can move this around pretty much wherever I want without any discomfort to my hand, because the hilt's a bit bigger. Now, how much bigger? Let's hold up these two hilts, one that's too small, one that's too big. And you will see that there's quite a considerable, there's about 1 centimetre of extra grip length there. Moreover, you will notice there's a difference in the shape of the pommel. Notice how this pommel disc is completely flat and this one is curved away from the hand. Now that's a very interesting feature because we find that, funnily enough, on quite a few Indian swords, and it is reminiscent of the Afghan tulwar. Now the Afghan tulwar has a completely hemispherical disc, so it still looks like a tulwar, and in fact tulwar and tulwar are the same word, they're just from different languages, or dialects even, I'm not even sure. But it's still overall a similar sword to the tulwar here, pretty similar. But by virtue of having that hemispherical pommel, you can use this thing almost like a Western sabre. You can extend the thing out not quite straight in line with the arm. You can get to about there before it jams up. But you can extend it out a lot further than you can do a Indian sword or tulwar with a flat disc, certainly, and even one with a gently curved disc like this. So there is a spectrum. There's two things here. There's what shape is the disc pommel and how long is the grip. And the simple fact is that while some tulwars might be extremely uncomfortable for me to hold, some of them are very comfortable for me to hold. And pretty much all pulwars are very comfortable to hold. Now, what I also wanted to mention as well was what's interesting is if we look at the precursors to these tulwars. So tulwars first appear in India around the 16th century, the 1500s, that kind of classical style of hilt like this, okay? But there were other types of hilts in India, and in fact there were precursors to that sword, forms of kanda and patisa and stuff like this, which actually also have forms of disc pommel, but they look more like this. So this is a very interesting Indian sword. 18th century, this is actually a European blade, a multi-filled, probably German made, could be Italian, but probably German made blade, of which there were thousands imported into India, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. And it's mounted on a Indian basket hilt, as they're known, for reasons you can see, because it has a large plate here, has a large plate at the front. Very, very protective hilt. Sometimes they had a padded liner inside them as well. So, and often you'll find this type of hilt on something like a kandar or something. So some people call these a kandar hilt. I don't think that's really technically right. It's just a basket hilt. The kandar is the type of blade. So this is a European sabre blade of the 1700s. Could even be late 1600s actually, with a native Indian basket hilt fitted onto it. Now you'll notice the disc, or the pommel on this, it's actually hollow, and it's sort of halfway between the Afghan tulwar. Okay, it's not as hemispherical as that, but this is hollow. And it's got stones in it, like often the Afghan, this one doesn't, but like often the Afghan ones have little prayer stones in as well. So those are probably, I think they're related to something to do with prayer in Islam, but I'm not 100% sure on the relevance of them. So it is hollow, so it has some comparison with the Afghan tulwar pommel, but it is a different shape, but it is nevertheless sort of disc-like. It's not hugely dissimilar to the later flat disc types that we see on tulwars, but it's a little bit thicker and not quite as wide. So it's not quite as wide here, and it's a little bit thicker there, with the result that it does sort of make you want to cut with the elbow and shoulder like the tulwar, but it's not quite as forceful in how it makes you want to do that. So you can sort of get away with using this a bit like a Highland basket hilt or European basket hilted sword. You can sort of cut from the wrist. It's not terribly comfortable, although that's largely by virtue of this guard and how it sits against the hand. And again, this grip is a little bit too short for me. So if we go back to hilt lengths, or grip length rather, you'll see that it's actually a little bit shorter in grip than this tulwar. This tulwar is just about perfect for me. I actually acquired this the other day and I'm extremely happy with it, incidentally. So probably if that was being made for me, I'd want a slightly longer hilt. So, to conclude, really just to say that we do find disc-like pommels appearing way back in Indian swords, all the way back into what would be the equivalent of the Dark Ages in Europe, so before 1000 AD, okay? And those sorts of disc-ish pommels, not always made of metal incidentally, sometimes made of wood and other organic materials, go all the way through to the 16th century. In the 16th century they start to appear on basket hilts, and they start to appear on the the early forms of pulwar and tulwar that start to appear around that time. And it seems to me that the disc pommels are there to encourage and reinforce a style of swordsmanship, a style of cutting that we find documented and described, written about in the 19th century in British sources, and we still see surviving within the surviving Indian martial arts as well. But when people make statements about the Indian hilt size and the way that you have to hold it, or you can't use it or can't hold it, it's very much dependent on, does that hilt fit your hand? And I think that sizing, if I just pull up those two tulwars again, sizing does play a part here. And the simple fact is that tulwar hilts can come in a variety of sizes, and because of the nature of that restrictive crossguard and disc pommel, simply 1 centimetre can make a big difference. So like half an inch grip length literally makes the difference between whether a sword is perfectly comfortable for you to use, or it's almost impossible for you to use, or it's at least so uncomfortable that you really wouldn't want to use it and you'd pick up the next sword you found. So really, I think these tulwar hilts were fitted to the user and have to be fitted to the user. So something to bear in mind if you're getting swords made for you, and I think this goes through to some European swords as well, if we're talking about Bronze Age swords, which sometimes have constrictive hilts, Viking era hilts, migration era hilts, perhaps even things like a Roman spatha as well. I think that the size of the hilt has to some degree be relevant to the size of the person's hand using it. I hope this has been thought-provoking. As always, I'm interested to hear your thoughts and observations below in the comments, and I will see you there. And I hope I'll see you back on this channel for my next video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.